Today, this is Indonesia recalls ambassador to Australia in spying row. This one's from AFP. Now, we've seen the spying scandal involving the US damage bilateral and diplomatic relations, but this a new dimension because it involves private conversations between the Indonesian president and his wife.
Well, it's a new dimension in that respect, yes, but keep in mind that, I mean, this is the story that it's the gift that keeps on giving, because there's new revelations every day. Edward Snowden released thousands of documents, only a few of which have actually seen the light of day. But I was talking to a colleague at Reuters the other day, and you know, for us, it's kind of like the scene in Casablanca where Claude Rains, the French police chief, says, "I'm shocked that there's gambling going on," and then the waiter comes up and hands him his winnings afterward. Everybody knows that governments spy, and that's what we pay them to do. And if they don't do it and something happens, then the people rise up and they say, "Why didn't you know about this? Why didn't you know? You should have known. You should have been spying on these guys." Now, you can always say it's not a nice thing to spy between friends and neighbors and allies. The U.S. spied on the private conversations of Angela Merkel in Germany. So it should be no surprise that this is actually going on.
So do you think that's going to be Australia's response, that, you know, everyone spies on everyone else? And
I think publicly, no. Publicly, they're going to say, "We're deeply sorry and we apologize, and you know, we'll never do that again."
But of course they will continue.
But of course they will continue to. And don't forget, Australia is part of what they call the Five Eyes organizations, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the UK. These countries have been cooperating on spying around the world for a long, long time. And this kind of spying also, and we actually make it easier for governments to spy on us nowadays, because if you've got a Facebook account or you're on Twitter or anything like that, you're actually just giving them the information. So
well, there's less and less privacy on the whole these days.
They can track your cell phone, so on and so forth. The problem is, and I was thinking about this yesterday before when I was reading up to come on the show, is the problem for the governments is it's like trying to get a drink of water from a fire hose. And everybody knows what a fire hose looks like and how that water just comes rushing out. But this is where the NSA is getting better in the United States, is because they've got the world's best supercomputers, and they're able to start looking for patterns. And that's what they're trying to do with a lot of this information, is look for patterns. That's why they're collecting the metadata from the phone calls, so on and so forth. But again, it's you know, I think actually what countries like Germany, France, in Europe, countries in Asia, I think what they're upset about is not that the U.S. or Australia, that they were spying on them. I think they're mad at the U.S. because they hired somebody like Ed Snowden and allowed him to get away with what he did.
Well, let me ask you as well, though, because a lot of the countries, in their defense, say it's in the interests of national security. But we know, for instance, in this case, it says in this article that it was really about 3G technology. So in these cases of spying, how much of it is about trade and how much of it is really about security?
I think I have a note that says anyone who thinks it's not about both is naive. And they will say, the U.S. will say in particularly, that this is all about national security. But in the process of doing all of this, because you have these multilateral meetings, trade negotiations, there's a Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiation that's going on, and they're obviously going to be picking up a lot of the chatter that comes from that. Does that help trade negotiations, and is the economic security of a country part of its national security? I would argue that it is. And so they're going to have to take all of those things into consideration. So yeah, they're going to, you know, commercially, you know, they may not go after a particular company, but they're going to scoop up all this information in the process, and that may help the trade negotiations. So economic security, national security, two sides of the same coin.
So it's all part and parcel. Well, let's move on to our next story. This one is also from AFP. Snubbed Taiwan breaks off ties with Gambia. Of course, Gambia severed diplomatic relations with Taiwan just a few days ago, and Taiwan now has officially done the same. But what does Gambia mean exactly by the strategic national interest? This is what they're saying. The reason why they've severed ties with Taiwan.
You know, it means that their strategic national interest is probably that they're getting investments from China, and that is the all over Africa, China is making huge inroads into the country, as a lot of, France has pulled back from Africa a little bit. The U.S. has never really had a large footprint there. They started a military command for Africa because of some of the things that have happened there in Somalia and places like that. But China is engaged in Africa in a big way for resources, for iron ore, for precious metals, for tin, for copper, for all of those things that China needs to drive its economy. And I think this is probably one of those situations where it's China's driving the train.
Now, China's actually denied that it put pressure on Gambia to sever ties with Taiwan, but it does say that the peaceful reunification of China is an irreversible trend. Do you believe this to be the case?
Well, I lived in Hong Kong for a long time. 10, 12 years. And, Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997 with great promises of a hands-off attitude for 50 years. We see today that that has not happened. Everybody knows that the mainland is not openly interfering, but is certainly calling the shots in many ways in Hong Kong. So I would argue that Taiwan is, to put it politely, looking askance at those promises of a hands-off attitude. But China plays the long game, so we don't know what's going to happen.
Okay, well, it also brings into question Mying Zhou's implementation of flexible diplomacy. Do you think it signals that that's been a failure?
I have no idea what flexible diplomacy means. I mean, diplomacy and negotiations and all of those things are by definition, you have to be flexible, you have to compromise. So I'm not real sure exactly what that means.
All right. Well, it does sort of mean that that both sides are supposed to refrain from luring one another from diplomatic ties, and in this case, it perhaps suggests that it hasn't. But we've only got 2 minutes left,
sure.
So let's move on to our next story. This one's from The Independent. Typhoon Haiyan Imelda Marcos's gems hidden amid the rivers of mud. Now, the luxury mementos of Tacloban's favourite daughter are risked from the storm. It does strike me that it would have been good to take those treasures and use them to help fund some of the rebuilding efforts.
That's a perfectly good idea, and I would be surprised if something like that didn't happen. The Marcos family is obviously trying to rebuild some of their reputation. Imelda herself is a second-term parliamentarian. Her nephew is the mayor of Tacloban, and he's been criticized a little bit for the response in Tacloban. She's got her son, Ferdinand Jr., is, I believe, a senator in the Philippines. So something like that might happen. I noticed on the wires again that the senator had gone back to Tacloban to do all that, to take a look at the devastation there. I mean, and that's one thing to point out too, is I think it's difficult for people. I would hesitate to criticize the Philippines' response for the simple fact that it's incredibly difficult to manage these kinds of situations. I was in Oklahoma City when the bombing happened in 1995, incredibly difficult. I was I forget when Hurricane Katrina hit the United States, but look at Hurricane Katrina there and the U.S.'s failed response, and that thousands of people at the Superdome without food or water or sanitary facilities. All of these, it's incredibly difficult. And you've got the Philippines, incredibly poor country, incredibly poor infrastructure, and of course it's going to be difficult to manage the response. And I think that people that are trying to help are trying to do their best. But it is an interesting story, and Marcos is a great story. Imelda, I think if she was in the U.S., she'd have her own reality show.
Now, it is interesting to know that the Marcoses are still very much revered in Tacloban, where Ferdinand Marcos was born, of course. It's remarkable given the legacy that they left behind as well, don't you think?
It's a very interesting legacy. The Philippines was a country of large landowners, sort of the people working, I'm trying to think of another thing, maybe it's something like Indochina with the French, where you had these large landowners who still today, even though they may have sold off some of their land, things like that, but they still remain a power force in the country. But I do have one, and I know I got to be quick, but just one little story about Imelda Marcos, because I'm from Oklahoma in the United States, yeah. And there's an Oklahoma connection, and there was an old lawyer, a guy named James Lynn, we called him Jimmy Lynn. and he was one of the old patrician lawyers with the silver hair and the silver mustache. He actually represented Imelda Marcos in some of the trials that she faced because they met when he was in New York representing Adnan Khashoggi. And so it was very funny for me to see him in a photograph one day, and I said, well, that's Imelda Marcos, and there's Jimmy Lynn. What's he doing there? And he's from Oklahoma.
So a bit of a personal connection there.
Personal connection.
I'm afraid we do have to wrap it up there, but it has been good having you on this morning. Thanks very much indeed for that. That's it for First Look Asia this morning. Do stay with the channel for AM Live just ahead. Bye for now.
And here is your Singapore update. Singapore is getting tough on all forms of harassment, in particular online harassment.